Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. On behalf of my colleagues here and at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., we're happy to have you here for our first lecture of the fall semester, and another timely one, I hope you'll agree. We're always happy to be here in this facility in Greenspun Hall, and so we thank our colleagues in the Greenspun College for making this available to us and for recording it, as you see. If you're watching us on our website or via public television, you have these people to thank for that opportunity. And as all good lectures are required on an academic campus, we have a PowerPoint part of the lecture tonight. That's already up on our website, so if you want to make reference to any pieces of information or data that Geoffrey presents, you won't have to scribble it down in a hurry. So let me give our colleague, who we're delighted to have here, Geoffrey Gertz, making his first visit to Brookings Mountain West. As with our scholars, he's in classes, giving this lecture, meeting with business and community leaders. And I'll tell you a little bit about Geoffrey. He's a fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings and a research associate in the Global Economic Governance Program at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on international political economy, particularly the politics of trade and foreign investment. You might have guessed that from the title of his lecture tonight. Prior to completing his PhD, Geoffrey worked as a speechwriter for World Bank President Jim Young Kim. He's originally from Ottawa, Canada. I don't know if you'll be able to tell that or not tonight from his presentation. He received his master's and PhD in international relations at the University of Oxford and his BA from Dabhol University. So we'll follow our usual format. Geoffrey will have a presentation. I think we'll have some time at the end for a little bit of Q&A. So let me turn this podium over to Geoffrey.
Great. Thanks a lot, Bill, for that kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here at Brookings Mountain West at UNLV. I'm sort of really enjoying my time here, and it's been great. So as Bill mentioned, I'm going to speak about commercial interests in American foreign policy today. I'll try and be relatively brief so we can get to Q&A and a broader discussion. Happy to talk sort of both about the presentation, but also sort of more generally about US trade policy today, everything that's going on in the news, sort of whatever's of interest. Okay. All right, so I want to start off with a little anecdote, a sort of mini scandal, barely even sort of registered on our kind of new scale of political scandals these days. But back early this year, there's a sort of moment in the news where there's a lot of focus on the Trump Organization's hotel in Panama. So obviously, the Trump Organization, a major international company, they had a hotel in Panama, and there was a dispute between the Trump company and the local business partners on the ground in Panama. This is sort of a contract dispute over who had rights to the corporation, to the sort of particular property, a relatively standard international business dispute. What made this sort of an interesting case to start looking about is the effort to politicize the case. Particularly what we saw is a sort of headline from New York Times here in April of the Trump company was reaching out to the president of Panama, asking him to get involved in this sort of commercial business dispute. And so that sort of raised a lot of red flags for people saying, why are we bringing in sort of politicians into this commercial dispute? Particularly, obviously, given that this is the corporation owned by the president and the president's family, what does this mean for American foreign policy? We've had a letter here from Senator Bob Menendez. So this is the top-ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee. He writes to the State Department and says, I've read in the news about this sort of the Trump Corporation writing out to the president of Panama. Says this raises serious conflict of interest questions that it could impinge on the United States' ability to conduct effective foreign policy. Menendez here is very worried that is U.S. foreign policy really being used to support the interests of the Trump administration, or is it being used to support kind of American national interest? Right? And so this is sort of this May scandal. It kind of fizzles out relatively quickly, but for me at least it raises a lot of interesting questions, because what Menendez is really hinting at there is that there's something sort of deeply illegitimate about the president getting involved in this transaction. And so if we want to know, is this actually a scandal? Is this a conflict of interest? We need to sort of understand how can we compare, a dispute involving the president's company to sort of what would have happened for any other company. So, would it really be surprising if the U.S. Embassy got involved to assist the Trump organization? And again, to answer that question, we have to say, well, what would the U.S. Embassy do in any other case? And so this sort of leads to this broader research question, which I've spent a few years thinking about really, which is asking, when, how, and why does the State Department intervene to help American companies abroad, particularly in relationships with foreign governments? And how does this sort of fit into our broader understanding of American foreign policy, and what kind of effects does it have on US foreign policy? So this is sort of the main question I want to be tackling in this talk today. To take a step back first, though, we should ask, why would investors turn to their diplomats for help? Kind of why does this issue arise in the beginning? And the basic idea here is that, foreign investment is risky. So when you're an investor and you're kind of going abroad into a foreign company, particularly into developing countries where there's sort of a weaker legal system, you're taking on a lot of risks. A sort of classic example of this is think of an oil company or a mining company. Maybe this company will be sort of invited in, they'll sign a contract with the government saying, we're going to come here and explore for oil. We'll sort of invest a lot of money in sort of looking for oil. Maybe you're there, you're sort of working in the country for sort of 5-10 years. Suddenly you hit oil. You're thinking, great, this is fantastic news. Sort of those hundreds of million dollars I've invested to kind of get to this point is finally going to pay off. And of course, that's the point where the government's going to turn around and say, actually, we're going to rip up this contract that we had. We're going to kick you out, and we're just going to sort of develop the oil fields ourselves. Right? So this is sort of a classic worry in sort of international business, in international relations. The threat that this government at any time can sort of kick you out of the country. And so if you're a foreign investor and you find yourself in that situation, what recourses do you really have? So first off, you can just try negotiating directly with the government. And in fact, this is what we see happens most often, that there are sort of constant back and forths between sort of these foreign multinationals and the governments where they're operating. They're constantly renegotiating the terms of their contracts and sort of, at different points in time, either the company may have more leverage or the government will have more leverage, and we'll see kind of how that plays out. But for some investors, particularly if you're in a period where you don't have a lot of leverage, that's obviously not a very attractive approach. Alternative is that you can go through the local court system. So for the most part, when foreign, sort of German companies investing here in the United States, if they had some sort of big complaint, they could go through the US court system. They wouldn't necessarily always be happy with the outcome, but they would sort of more or less trust it. If you're investing in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you probably don't have as much faith in that court system. Either that it's just sort of not going to be effective and it's going to be slow, or kind of quite more likely that it's going to be sort of rigged in favor of the government. So particularly if you have a dispute with the government as the sort of opposing party in your dispute, you don't really want to be sitting in the courts that are often sort of run by the foreign government. You're not going to trust them to give you a fair hearing. And so if you're not going to directly negotiate with the government, if you're not going to try and go through the local court system to resolve your dispute, what are you going to do? And it turns out time and again, you're going to turn to your diplomats, your sort of home state diplomatic staff, and ask them to help you resolve this case. So we see this a lot historically. So if we go back to the early 1900s, see an early example of this sort of dollar diplomacy as it can be known in Nicaragua. So the La Luz y Los Angeles mining company, sort of a gold mining company, American-owned, that invests on the Nicaraguan coast. They sort of show up, I think, 1903, 1904. Again, they have a contract signed with the current Nicaraguan government, giving them the right to mine for gold on the coast here. A few years later, the Nicaraguan government sort of turns against this mining company, basically sort of tears up that contract. The owners of this mine are sort of in a pinch. They don't really know what to do. It turns out the owners of this mine are all from the sort of Pittsburgh area. Great news, the new Secretary of State, Philander Knox at the time, is also from this sort of group of Pittsburgh industrialists. So they write to their friend Philander and they say, listen, you really need to come help us out here. You need to get the government to kind of come in and push on the Nicaraguans to get them to hand back control of this mine to these American owners. And what we see is that the Secretary Knox sort of really takes up this cause, and he really sort of pushes through the US political system to kind of increase American diplomatic pressure on Nicaragua. This ultimately leads to US Marines kind of invading Nicaragua. There's an ongoing rebellion. The US Marines invade essentially on the side of the rebels and kind of contribute at least to overthrowing President Zelaya. And, historians kind of continue to debate this, but there's pretty clear evidence that the effort to protect this mining interest was one of the real reasons why the US got so involved, and particularly why sort of the Marines went in. So we have a quote from the US consul, sort of looking back on it after the time. He comes out and says that this particular mining dispute really was the cause of the desire to eliminate Zelaya. And he's sort of becoming quite sort of critical of this decision, saying, why are we sort of spending so much time and effort? Obviously it's a huge lift for the United States to send in the Marines, sort of just to defend these mining interests. And so if you think about who gains and who loses from this type of system, so the businesses overall were relatively happy with this world, right? As long as you kind of had powerful friends in governments, and certainly back in this period, if you were somebody who was investing out in Latin America, you also probably were relatively powerful domestically and had some friends you could call on. You could call this diplomatic protection to your advantage. But as we see in that quote from the consul that I just showed, increasingly diplomats, and particularly as sort of diplomats professionalize, and we get a real class of professional diplomats, they're starting to say, why are we spending so much time sort of involved in these investment disputes? Again, this is a quote from the Nicaragua example. This is from a former Marine who was involved in it. And he's sort of here, again, kind of critically looking back, saying, this whole revolution is inspired and financed by Americans who have these wildcat investments down here. They're trying to force the United States to intervene to make their investments good. So kind of, there are these powerful lobbying interests who are just sort of compelling American foreign policy to their own interest and sort of forcing these, really quite expensive interventions on the behalf of the United States just to sort of make sure that their investments pay off eventually. So fast forward a few decades, we see kind of some similar dynamics playing out in Cuba. So Cuban Revolution, 1959, sort of, got young Fidel Castro here who comes to power. Sort of almost immediately after the revolution, the Castro regime has a new land reform policy. Effectively what this policy is going to do is take away a lot of land owned by US sugar plantations and sort of redistribute it to the state. The American sugar companies, sort of not surprisingly, are not happy with this. And so again, just like the owners of the Nicaraguan mine, they're sort of talking to their friends in US government saying, look, we really need to sort of push down on the Castro regime and sort of fight back. But the State Department is very nervous about this. The State Department, so kind of crucial point to remember here is that this is really just, within a year or so of the Castro revolution, the State Department still doesn't know, is Castro going to take Cuba into sort of the Soviet sphere, or can we kind of keep him away? Sort of early Cold War strategizing. We want to keep Cuba as an ally. Cuba's been a close ally up until now. It's not obvious early on in Castro's regime, sort of, can Cuba still be a kind of American ally, or are they now kind of firmly in the opposite camp? So the State Department, saying, look, we understand you US sugar companies are mad, but we're not going to sort of piss off Castro just to keep you happy. That our top priority needs to be keeping Cuba out of the Sino-Soviet orbit and sort of making sure they're still part of our system. And so we don't actually want to sort of really come down hard on Castro for this. We want to sort of, let's work out a deal. Maybe the Americans aren't going to get all of their sort of money back, but we can sort of try and keep Castro as an ally. As it turns out, just as in Nicaragua, it's the sort of private sugar interests that carry the day in this internal fight. The State Department is sort of overruled by the Treasury Department. The US does come down quite hard on Cuba, basically prevents Cuba from exporting sugar at all to the United States. And this sort of, just as the State Department worries, this decision kind of puts Castro on the path to entering the Soviet regime. So again, we see this sort of tension between these two possible goals. And this is really the dilemma that the State Department faces time and again throughout this Cold War period. Is that you have private companies who are coming to the US government, often going through their friends either in Congress or in Treasury or Commerce, and sort of asking for diplomatic help abroad. But the State Department is saying, we don't want to be kind of pulled into all of these individual sort of transactional fights that these sort of wildcat investors are getting into, we're focused on the kind of grand strategy of fighting the Cold War. We're focused on containing communism. We're not here to kind of haggle over sort of day-to-day investment disputes. Particularly as in the Cuba case, where the threat of sort of going, aggressively intervening against a kind of current regime to back investors is going to kind of throw an alliance into risk. So again, the State Department is constantly thinking about how are we kind of keeping developing country governments on our side and keeping them away from the Soviet side. We don't want to be kind of complaining to governments about these sort of haggling over commercial disputes when we're worried about maintaining our alliances. And so the way we see this play out is that, time and again, these diplomats, they want to be focused on this high politics of containing communism. They don't want to be dragged into lowly commercial work. And so what that ends up happening at the State Department is that there's really sort of strong disincentives to get involved in commercial work. It's kind of a long quote here, but I think it's really telling, so I like putting it up. This is from Susan Schwab, who was at the State Department for a long time in the sort of commerce economic side, sort of eventually left state and went on to become US Trade Representative several years later. But here she's talking about the kind of culture at the State Department in the 1970s. She talks about how the State Department places no priority on the commercial function. And Foreign Service officers who liked commercial work were doomed not to advance in the system. And let's face it, some officers who were not of the highest caliber ended up getting stuck doing commercial work. So you have this odd mix of people who were real good at what they did and weren't rewarded, who just weren't good at what they did. None of them were judged on the basis of how they did commercial work. So this is sort of how commercial work is treated at the State Department, really throughout the whole Cold War period. The kind of very ambitious diplomats are going to be out kind of, doing grand strategy, fighting communism. You've got this sort of ragtag bunch of hangers-on that are sort of doing some of the commercial work behind the scenes, but it's completely disincentivized as a sort of bureaucratic culture question. And so that really persists sort of throughout the Cold War. And then, we get to the collapse of communism, the end of the Cold War, and it's this real shock to the State Department. The State Department didn't really see it coming. They've sort of built up their culture and built up their sort of strategy over decades around this sort of paradigm of containing communism. And so now, late 1980s, early 1990s, there's sort of a need for a big shift at the State Department. And the State Department kind of looks around the world and says, for decades, we've been able to go to Congress and get funded easily just by saying, look, it's important to have a strong State Department because we're out fighting communism. Suddenly that explanation no longer exists. That doesn't really hold. State Department says, we need a new constituency who's going to support us and kind of will lobby on behalf of our interests towards Congress. And they realize that cultivating that constituency amongst American businesses is going to provide them a lot of domestic political backing. So we're at this moment, sort of in the early 1990s, where markets are starting to open overseas, sort of this early globalization period. And the State Department basically decides that we can go out and kind of sell American businesses on, look how great it is to have a strong State Department. We're going to help you kind of expand overseas. We want to be kind of hand in hand with you as you sort of enter the sort of new world of emerging markets. And so we see a real pivot within the State Department and sort of within the bureaucratic culture. So kind of, almost immediately after the end of the Cold War, there's sort of this internal State Department debate saying, how are we going to kind of reorganize and respond to this changing global order? What they come up with is, we're going to have a major conference on commercial diplomacy where we're going to invite all these businesses to come talk to us and sort of, explain to them the benefits of a strong diplomatic presence. We see lots of strong political backing, particularly when Warren Christopher is Secretary of State in the early 1990s, the first Clinton administration, and then Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State later on. So Warren Christopher, in his hearing before the Senate to be confirmed as Secretary of State, the senators ask him sort of what will be your priorities as Secretary of State, and the first priority he lists is sort of American businesses and American jobs. That, the point of a strong American foreign policy is going to be supporting American businesses, which is really quite a dramatic shift from how it played out in the Cold War. Similarly, Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, so she sends around this kind of became quite well-known memo to every ambassador in the world, known as the Ambassadors as CEO memos, where she's basically sort of instructing ambassadors that you need to be out helping American businesses, kind of helping Americans win contracts overseas, sort of government procurement markets become a big deal. And she sort of really doubles down this sort of economic statecraft idea, the sort of merging together of economics and foreign policy. And so we see the kind of high-level strategic shift. We also see it play out at the sort of bureaucratic culture level. So there's a whole rash of new sort of training programs introduced. There are things like, the State Department creates an award for the diplomats who are most effective at commercial work, something that they had never done before, if we think back to those quotes in the 1970s. Commercial officers start getting sort of promoted more often. I think in the sort of late 1990s, we get the first time a commercial officer becomes ambassador as sort of a big benchmark and kind of the increasing importance of commercial work. So there's a sort of real shift within the culture of the State Department. And so then sort of how does this play out on the ground? We've sort of looked at the Nicaragua case, the Cuba case. What are sort of more modern examples of this kind of diplomacy? And so one big early example is from Enron's sort of adventures in India. So Enron, as some of you probably remember, was a major American energy company. In the early sort of 1990s, they decide they want to go into India. They're sort of building what's known as the Dabhol power plant in India. At the time, it's the largest single foreign investment ever in India, and sort of $1 billion project. Sort of under the Bill Clinton administration, there's a lot of initial support for Enron going in. But kind of quite early on, I think the power plant, they sort of build the first phase of it, they start operating, sort of stumble on the second phase. They quickly realized that the sort of pricing mechanism they'd worked out for energy was way off. And so this dispute kind of, the plant really sort of falls apart relatively quickly on. India sort of refuses to pay Enron what Enron sort of thinks they should be paid. And so Enron kind of, like the sugar owners before them, turns to the US embassy and says, you need to help us out here. And we see a very strong response on the part of the US. So the US ambassador to India is sort of constantly calling up various members of the Indian cabinet to sort of press Enron's case. Secretary of State, this is sort of into the early 2000s when the dispute really takes off, and Colin Powell is Secretary of State. He makes this a big deal. This becomes sort of one of the most important issues in the US-India relationship, against sort of like a pretty big, important bilateral relationship. And this individual investment dispute is kind of often on the agenda. Dick Cheney's the vice president at the time. He's sort of pushing the case. At the National Security Council, there's actually a Dabhol working group, which is sort of meeting in Washington to sort of talk about, how can we coordinate US government policy on sort of helping resolve this Dabhol dispute? Again, a very intense, a very structured approach. A sort of funny end to the story, which is that the Indian Prime Minister at the time was visiting Washington. Enron's lobbyists had been working really hard to kind of get this dispute onto the agenda for the heads of state summit meeting between President George Bush and the Indian Prime Minister at the time. And we know from some internal Enron letters that later came out that initially this dispute was on the agenda, and then it sort of drops off the agenda. And what ends up happening is that sort of later that week is when the Enron scandal kind of fully hits the news. Enron sort of collapses as a company within a month, really. And so this dispute sort of falls off the agenda, but we can see that sort of right up until the end, Enron was sort of pushing very hard to get the US government involved here. A second example is Occidental Petroleum in Ecuador. So Occidental Petroleum, or Oxy as it often goes by, they invest in Ecuador. They, again, are one of the largest foreign investors in Ecuador at the time. I think they originally go into Ecuador in the 1990s. This dispute really emerges in the mid-2000s. But there's, again, a relatively simple contract dispute between Occidental Petroleum and the government of Ecuador. Ecuador is threatening to cancel this contract. Again, Oxy, like many investors, sort of as soon as they get word that the government is kind of potentially coming after them, they go straight to the US Embassy in Quito and ask for support. Again, we see this very strong push from the US Embassy. The ambassador is kind of calling up the head of state, the foreign minister, the energy minister, the finance minister, kind of anyone she can get on the phone to sort of push Oxy's case. That happens on the ground in Ecuador. We sort of see a similar push in Washington, D.C. During this time, Ecuador and the US are actually involved in negotiating a free trade agreement. And so these negotiations have been going on for years. And as this dispute comes to a head, the US eventually says, we're canceling our ongoing free trade negotiations, and explicitly cites this dispute as the reason why the US is not going to be signing a free trade agreement with Ecuador. So that happens in 2005, until today, really, there has not been any sort of effort to revive those free trade agreement talks. But again, we see this is sort of a quite strong diplomatic push and quite strong sort of price that Ecuador pays in its relationship with the United States. So these are sort of two big disputes that sort of got into the news, but they're also relatively rare. That sort of, both the Enron case and the Oxy case, for sort of different reasons, ended up being quite publicized. So, in Enron, the reason we know so much about this is that after Enron collapsed, there was sort of a big congressional investigation into US government relations with Enron, and sort of that's how all this came to light. Otherwise, it all happened privately. Similarly with Occidental, it was only sort of once we got to the point of having the free trade agreement negotiations sort of blow up that a lot of this sort of previous pressure came out. But we know that most of this commercial diplomacy occurs behind closed doors. It's never reported that it's the ambassador calling up the finance minister. We don't really know sort of what's going on behind these doors. So, as academics, that makes it a very difficult issue to study. We can see the kind of big, most famous cases, but we don't see anything else. And so, in some research that I've done with a couple of colleagues, we turn to a new data source to try and figure out actually what's going on behind the scenes, and we use the leaked State Department cables. So this is a data set of 250,000 cables that were sort of internal US State Department cables, subsequently publicly leaked through WikiLeaks. And it's sort of an online searchable database now that you can go through all these cables. They're the communications between embassies and Washington, D.C. And then we can search through these cables and identify investment disputes, and then go through and say, all right, what did US diplomats actually do? So that's what we do. We search this database. We find 440 individual disputes. And we sort of go through each of them and see, all right, how did the US get involved in these ongoing disputes? It's a bit small, I'm not sure how well you can read it. But we essentially code each of these disputes on a 1 to 5 scale to measure the intensity of US engagement. So at the highest level of what we call a 5, explicit issue linkage. So this is like the Oxy case where there's sort of a real, hard sanction that the host government faces. So whether that's withdrawing aid benefits or with canceling a free trade agreement or something like that. Sort of just below that, we call high-level diplomatic agenda. So this is when dispute is discussed at the head of state level. So again, sort of relatively rarely, but sort of at head of state or during an official bilateral visit. At the mid-level, this is when dispute is discussed kind of just generally in day-to-day diplomacy. Sort of just below that, again, we have sort of more technocratic interventions. This is not a sort of diplomatic intervention, but this is more sort of a regulator talking to another regulator saying, how can we figure this out? There are lots of sort of customs disputes and that kind of stuff that ends up in that category. And then finally, sort of if the US government doesn't do anything at all. So I think kind of a few key takeaways that we see from this data. So one point is just that this diplomacy is relatively common. And again, this sort of tracks on to what you hear if you go sort of ask ambassadors about it. It tracks on to what you hear if you ask companies about it. Sort of, yes, this diplomacy still happens. It mostly isn't reported. It mostly happens behind closed doors, but sort of it is going on. But the other big takeaway that's sort of quite notable is that those Enron and Oxy cases that we started off talking about, those are really the exception. That sort of very aggressive, very explicit sort of intense diplomatic fighting, that's not what most of the cases look like. Most of the cases look like more routine day-to-day diplomacy of just in the usual course of what the ambassador is sort of doing that week. When they're meeting with the foreign minister, they're bringing up whatever outstanding investment disputes may exist in the country, and sort of just trying to work through these disputes in a more sort of low level, less high pressure, less sort of high stakes means. And so to give an example of what that looks like in practice, so again, this is sort of a narrative that we're able to draw out from all the information in the cables. It's the case of Gerald Metals in Tajikistan. So unlike Oxy, unlike Enron, this is a relatively small company. They're a metal commodities trader based out of Connecticut. they had entered into an agreement with the Tajik state-owned aluminum company. Basically, Gerald Metals had sort of paid $20 million to this state-owned company with the expectation that they were going to get a shipment of $20 million of aluminum. There's then a sort of shakeup at the Tajik company. They kind of kick out the old board, a new board comes in. They say all those previous deals are sort of null and void now. Gerald Metals is left saying, wait a minute, where's our $20 million that we already paid you? And so Gerald Metals, again, like many other companies, they go to the US Embassy. They say, Ambassador, you need to help us out here. What we see is that it's not the case of sort of really threatening, really saying, we're going to pull out all of our aid, or we're going to kind of, this is a major thorn in the relationship. But just sort of day to day in the ambassador's work, when they're sort of meeting with the finance minister, they'll come in and say, all right, there's sort of 6 items on our agenda. 1, we're talking about sort of US economic assistance. 2, we're interested in sort of European integration, something else. But then sort of maybe number 4 or 5 on that agenda is, remember, you still owe Gerald Metals $20 million. You need to resolve this dispute. This dispute is sort of a blemish on your reputation. It's hurting your investment climate. So we want to kind of work with you to resolve these outstanding problems. So it's a much more sort of less aggressive, less coercive approach to commercial diplomacy. And what we see, interestingly, is sort of, so why this is one of my favorite cases is there's a great story of how it's ultimately resolved, which is the ambassador is invited to a kind of formal sort of dinner banquet hosted by the banking industry. This is a sort of ceremonial event with lots of traditional Tajik dancing and drinking and all that kind of stuff. Ambassador happens to be seated next to a sort of relatively high up person in the economy ministry. And kind of over a few drinks, the two of them eventually say, all right, we're going to kind of hash out this deal. It happens very informally. It's not a coercive thing. It's just sort of we get to this moment where the ambassador can kind of let's sit down together, let's work this out, let's get to a deal, and that ultimately is how the dispute gets resolved. So we see in that Gerald case, there's sort of one example at least of how this kind of diplomacy can be useful to firms. And Gerald Metals sort of comes back and says, we couldn't have resolved this without diplomatic help, so we're sort of really thankful to the embassy for all of your assistance. But kind of looking at individual cases, it's still hard to know sort of how systematically important is diplomacy to American businesses, right? We can kind of see little bits here and there, but it's hard to test sort of at a broader level. And so to try and get a handle on, does this actually matter at a kind of larger scale, I run some tests using ambassador vacancies. So again, just like as in the Gerald case, ambassadors often play a crucial role in these disputes. So an ambassador is somebody who has the sort of political backing, the political leverage to be able to meet with the finance minister, meet with the foreign minister, or the head of state, can kind of come into the offices at a high enough level to get the sort of real resolution that is necessary. But we also know that ambassadors rotate in and out of countries. And what sort of is perhaps surprising, was surprising me when I first started looking at this, is that there's often long gaps between when one ambassador leaves and the next ambassador arrives. The process of new ambassadors being appointed to the United States means they need to be voted on by the Senate. That can sometimes take a long time. So sometimes one ambassador will leave and the next ambassador will show up 2 weeks later, and there'll be sort of almost no gap. But sometimes you'll have gaps of 6 months, 8 months, a year, maybe longer. Again, not for any real sort of political reason, just because sort of the process got slowed down in the United States. And so as a social scientist, this was really helpful for me because it means that I can sort of use that variation in is there an ambassador present or not as a test of the power of commercial diplomacy. And so the question I'm asking is sort of, is it true that companies suffer when there's no ambassador present? And it turns out, we do see some evidence of this. So overall, if we look at investment arbitration claims, so these are the legal claims that companies bring to arbitration courts when they're claiming they've been mistreated by a company. It turns out that there's about 25% higher likelihood of arbitration claims when there's no US ambassador than when there is a US ambassador. This effect is really concentrated in developing countries with weak rule of law, sort of where, precisely where the institutions aren't very strong, where there's much more sort of space for that informal bargaining rather than sort of having a set rule structure. So we see that in these countries with a weak rule of law, if the ambassador is vacant for the entire year, the expected number of arbitration claims is about twice as high as if the ambassador is present the entire year. So again, to me at least, I think this is evidence that when the ambassador is there, behind the scenes, they're resolving these disputes before they ever escalate to these arbitration levels. When the ambassador is not there, this diplomacy is still happening, but it's not going to be nearly as effective. And so because it's not as effective, you see it's more likely that the dispute is going to kind of continue escalating and get to the point of an arbitration claim. Whereas maybe if we had an ambassador in place, it would have been kind of resolved before it got that far. So I sort of started off talking about how there were sort of strong interventions in sort of Nicaragua in the 1900s, sort of talking now that there's sort of still a lot of interventions. How do we compare these two periods? So when we see that, similar to the early 1900s and unlike during the Cold War period, commercial interests are again an important component of US foreign policy. The big difference is that, we're certainly not sending in the Marines anymore like we used to do in Nicaragua. Instead, it's this much more sort of I would say less coercive, although I think there are interesting debates to have about sort of what do we mean when we talk about coercive, and sort of there certainly is pressure put on these countries to respect American property rights, but it's sort of a more sort of transactional approach, maybe we can say. Also importantly, I think, when we study why the State Department gets involved in these things, what we don't see is that sort of early 1900 approach where you had, powerful private companies that were really sort of twisting the arms of diplomats to get them involved against their will. It turns out that today diplomats are actually really happy to get involved. They're the ones who are sort of in the lead often. They want to be out there sort of selling the State Department to American businesses. So it's not that sort of private pressure is compelling these diplomats to sort of take on these issues. It's diplomats themselves that are taking the initiative. And finally, kind of following up on that, the reason diplomats are happy to get involved is that today they see commercial diplomacy as sort of supporting and reinforcing their broader goals rather than kind of undermining their broader goals, as happened in the Cuba example. Just sort of summing up in some conclusions, so I think kind of from a policy standpoint, the sort of big takeaway from all of this is that having a strong, sort of well-resourced diplomatic corps does provide lots of benefits to American companies. I say when I present this work, the State Department is always quite happy because they're always sort of, they've been trying to say this, and I can actually sort of put some data behind it that seems to back up what they've been saying. And so that, I think has implications for how we think about sort of cuts to the State Department and sort of State Department staffing these days. Looking forward, it seems to me that we're sort of entering this era of growing nationalist economic competition. And so I read that at least as saying that commercial diplomacy is likely to become stronger and kind of more competitive in the years ahead. Again, this is certainly not by any means something that only the United States does. Sort of Japan has a very strong commercial diplomacy program. The Germans have a strong program. The Chinese certainly have a strong program. And so you see sort of, these different embassies are sort of fighting it out, particularly over government procurement contracts. And that's a trend that I think is going to continue in the years ahead. And finally, maybe a bit sort of a more academic conclusion is that certainly within the political science research over the last few years, there's been a lot of work studying the formal institutions of the world economy. So there's lots of research on the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, the kind of formal rules and institutions that govern the global economy. But I think kind of in all our attention to that, we've missed that these sort of informal interactions still really matter. The informal interactions that we used to think of being sort of, tied to old sort of diplomats in smoky rooms, sort of hashing things out. We think that doesn't happen as much anymore. But actually, there's a lot of that still going on behind the scenes, and it's often still quite important. But I think it's an area that sort of political scientists in particular have been ignoring for a while. So that's sort of where I'm trying to take a lot of my more research. Great, and I will end there, and happy for any questions.
Very good talk. I think especially the case with Panama seems like it's kind of jumping on the edge of emoluments. I was wondering if you might briefly address emoluments and corrupt practices and how those might impinge on some of this.
Sure. So, as far as emoluments, I think you don't see sort of explicit payments very often. What I would say is interesting, so kind of the Trump organization is obviously unique. That's sort of, we typically don't have that kind of relationship that, the head of state also has sort of a large multinational sort of empire. But what is interesting in terms of sort of how the US government puts pressure on foreign governments, it's not a kind of direct payoff to the private interest, but it's sort of incentivizing foreign governments to say, if you want to have good relationships with the United States, you need to resolve these outstanding disputes. So it is a sort of informal pressure, informal kind of coercion, again, not necessarily to get a sort of direct payment kind of thing, but saying that, we're not sending the Marines, but we're kind of subtly telling you that it will be in your best interest to have this dispute go away. And that I certainly do see a lot of parallels to sort of some of the discussions around emoluments.
I'm curious, how did the transition in the 90s take place? Did the Cold Warriors pivot, or did they leave?
Good question. A bit of both. So it turns out, so it's the American Foreign Service Association, so it's the sort of public union of diplomats. They played a big role in it. So they were the ones who sort of started to think, they play a big role in the lobbying with Congress and sort of, how do we kind of present the case to Congress that we should have a strong State Department? And they were ones who really pushed this sort of focus on businesses. So I will say sort of a lot of the Cold Warriors at the top left, and sort of as the new political leaders came in, sort of certainly Warren Christopher early on, he was very big on this kind of stuff. And then sort of in the more lower level or sort of mid-level, you did see the sort of culture change comes very slowly. Right? So sort of, it certainly isn't overnight that all of the diplomats who have sort of been fighting these Cold Warrior things decide, they spent their whole careers looking down on this commercial work. They don't kind of instantly shift to say, oh yes, this is great. They're being told by their bosses that's what they should do, but it's sort of a very slow bureaucratic change. And you see over sort of time and time again, this sort of same back and forth of, the bosses are always saying, we need to do more commercial work, and there's some sort of resistance from the staff on that.
I enjoyed your Enron example because if my memory serves me correctly, that debacle led to bankruptcy and to ultimately the diversification of the Las Vegas economy, because Enron created a fiber hub that was supposed to be used as a commodity trading. And that ultimately was purchased out of bankruptcy by the person who is the head of Switch Corporation, which is now traded on the New York Stock Exchange using that infrastructure. So I'm interested. While you're here, you might want to visit their facilities since you use the Enron example sort of out of the ashes. If my history is correct, tell me, when secretaries of state, instead of using diplomatic cables, have their own private servers, does that impact at all on academics and doing your work?
So, obviously we don't know what we don't know. So kind of, I think, so these cables, there are lots of sort of thorny issues about using cables for academic work. I think when they first came out, it was quite controversial. It's become less controversial sort of over time. As an academic, kind of, I think generally sort of the more data we can get our hands on, the better. But one other thing that I'm quite interested in is that a lot of times when the sort of official history of diplomacy is written, the kind of official historians want to be talking about, oh, we were this close to the brink of war, and kind of all of the high drama points. And a lot of the sort of more day-to-day diplomacy doesn't enter into that kind of official history. So one of the things that I'm working on is sort of trying to dig out, what is the archival material we can look at that gets us to this sort of, these are the things that even if they're publicly known, they're not going to be on the front page of newspapers. They're just not that interesting to many people, even if they're interesting to me. And so trying to sort of find sources for that kinds of data.
Does the revolving door come into your research at all? In particular, people from industry moving into the State Department. At the upper levels, we know of the Tillersons and others, but has that at all influenced the process that you're studying?
Yeah, so I I've been trying to come up with a good way to sort of systematically test this and haven't, but I can say that anecdotally, having spoken to a lot of people, so a number of political appointee ambassadors will come from business backgrounds. So they sort of have not been diplomats, they haven't worked in the State Department like sort of career appointee ambassadors have. And so when they get to their posts, sort of the thing that they understand best is the business world. So I've heard anecdotally from lots of people that the ambassadors who really take this on are the ones who come from business backgrounds. That they show up and they say, yes, international business, that's something I get, that kind of this other world of diplomacy, I don't pay that much attention to, and I might let my kind of number two do a lot of the sort of other, more sort of traditional diplomacy work. But the kind of business background political appointee ambassadors will say, I'm going to really sort of throw myself into helping American companies, win procurement contracts and that kind of work. So that does seem to be true. I haven't sort of rigorously tested it, so I can't definitively say, but kind of anecdotally, I've heard that for sure. Yep.
Gerald, in your research, what is the value, like if an ambassador does get involved, what is the actual monetary value of the deal, or can you peg a value to it? And is there a prior relationship between the business and the ambassador, or is it whoever is there, they walk up to the embassy and say, we need help with this deal?
Sure, both good questions. So on the first one, it varies a lot. Some of these are kind of huge billion-dollar deals, but kind of perhaps surprisingly to me, the ambassadors also get involved in quite small deals often. That there are some disputes that are sort of, there's a dispute in Cote d'Ivoire that I look at. It's a little kind of $6 million dispute. In the world of the global economy, that's sort of peanuts. But the U.S. government takes a very strong approach on this case, and sort of they view this case as being sort of about bigger principles. This is about a sort of telecoms case, and it's about sort of telecoms regulation. And so since the United States is sort of invested in the bigger principle of sort of having well-run, liberalized telecoms regulations, they kind of continually bring this case up with the Cote d'Ivoire authorities, even though there's not that much money actually at stake. So sort of, even in some small disputes, you will see high engagement, even though sort of overall it's the bigger cases that are going to get the more attention. I think it's probably true. On your second question of pre-existing relationship, that's also really interesting. So one thing that we do find is that both when you go talk to the sort of diplomats and when you go talk to the investors that have been involved in these cases, they will both tell you that the process works much more smoothly the sort of earlier the investor got in touch with the ambassador. So kind of, the U.S. Embassy is very happy to have the embassy wants to have the investors show up kind of from the first day that they get there and sort of talk to the diplomats and sort of say, here's what we're doing, here's how we're involved. The embassy really hates it when sort of a dispute has been kind of festering for a long time, and then it gets to a crisis point, and only at that point does the investor go talk to the ambassador, because the ambassador is sort of on the back foot a little bit then and has to kind of get caught up. So generally sort of the earlier you can establish that relationship, the more valuable it's going to be if a problem does kind of come up.
Is there a lot of cases where they have a personal relationship beforehand, or?
Not really, I don't think. So kind of not a personal relationship in the sense of, so the Nicaragua case where it's sort of, we were friends from sort of, old Pittsburgh industrialists, sort of that kind of thing you don't see very much these days, at least I don't seem to see it. But there is, you have a pre-existing relationship through your activities on the ground. So kind of, often what we'll see is that the American Chamber of Commerce, the sort of foreign chamber of commerces in these foreign countries, they will host kind of breakfast roundtables with all the big American investors and the ambassador. And maybe they'll kind of get together every month or so. So sort of they know what each of them are doing, so you sort of have that kind of pre-existing relationship, but not the sort of personal friendship from 30 years ago. That makes sense.
Geoffrey, to what extent, if any, have the sort of the day-to-day operations of the ambassadors or the philosophy of those folks changed under the current administration?
Yeah, so it's a bit hard to tell. I think the kind of real big takeaway, so we sort of brought up Rex Tillerson a bit before. So when Tillerson was first named as going to be Secretary of State, I sort of wrote a short article saying, what this really tells us is that this sort of commercial work is going to become sort of hypercharged at the State Department, and they're going to sort of really put everything into this, that you have a sort of businessman coming in to run this. I thought it was a good point at the time. As it turns out, the sort of fact that so many of the sort of higher ranking people at the State Department have left, and there have been so many vacancies at the State Department, has really undermined the ability to kind of implement this diplomacy effectively. So I don't know if there's been that big a shift in sort of mindset as I kind of thought there might have been, sort of particularly because there's been so much sort of internal turmoil at the State Department and kind of so many vacancies, so many sort of bleeding of a lot of the top people, that it sort of has undermined this effort to push commercial work, I think. Yep.
Does the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act apply to ambassadors?
Yes, you mean in the sense that kind of...
If the ambassador does it, it's legal.
So, yeah, it certainly isn't legal. And that actually is one thing that, when you talk to diplomats about kind of getting involved, so, the cases where diplomats really won't go to bat for you is if there's any sort of semblance of corruption around it. So like, if you got your contract through bribery, the ambassador is going to be very, very, is going to do everything they can to kind of keep you at arm's length, I would say. They wouldn't necessarily sort of report you under that, but certainly these days, the State Department is sort of influenced by those concerns.
Specifically in the Gerald metals case, since Tajikistan is one of the most corrupt countries, the ambassador did not offer any bribes or anything.
Sort of certainly nothing that we can have, yeah, I would have zero evidence of that.
I was wondering if you've seen a shift. You were talking about how we use these types of commercial work and for leverage, right? To kind of say, hey, if you settle this dispute, we'll have a better relationship with the U.S. government. But that has shifted with the current administration, and are foreign governments less likely to kind of want to settle these disputes right now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I can't say I have any sort of real evidence of that, but it'll be plausible to me, right? So sort of what's great about being the U.S. ambassador, if you're in that position, is that basically any country in the world, you can kind of walk in and you can get a meeting with probably the finance minister, if not the head of state, kind of quite easily. If you are from Belgium or New Zealand or wherever else, their ambassadors are still sort of out there trying to fight for their companies, but the New Zealand ambassador is not going to have the same weight as the U.S. ambassador. So that's sort of a big advantage to U.S. firms. If foreign countries are less interested in kind of cultivating that relationship, then that would hurt foreign businesses. It would sort of hurt American businesses in their operations. So I can't say I sort of know cases of that, but the sort of logic would suggest that it's true. Questions? Oh, one more about there.
So how does the day-to-day commercial works on individual disputes and arbitrations interact with the larger negotiations around free trade agreements and those kind of, I guess, grand strategy diplomacy? Yeah, so one thing that I think is really interesting is that, historically we saw often these would point in opposite directions. But sort of since the Cold War, they're really sort of are pointing together. So a lot of what the U.S. is doing, the U.S. diplomatic strategy is saying, we want to sort of spread capitalism, we want to encourage market-based economies, we want to encourage the rule of law. And so diplomats are using these individual disputes as kind of teaching moments for foreign governments to say, here's the kind of correct way to sort of regulate your telecom sector, right? So sort of these small disputes that on their own terms, these small disputes don't seem to have that much at stake. The US government gets really involved because it says, this is an example to kind of make the broader point of here's how you should sort of run your liberal economy. So that kind of aligns with why diplomats want to get involved in the first place. They see these as opportunities to sort of push a lot of that bigger messaging.
If I may, as a criticism of what your talk is about, is I believe that you are giving way too much weight to the role of the ambassadors. I spent roughly 40 years in banking throughout Latin America. I was resident in Peru for 6 years, Ecuador for 4, Argentina for a number as well. And it's not the ambassadors who really are they are interlocutors, if you will, Because you haven't even referred to OPEC, you haven't referred to MAGI, you haven't referred to the agreements that nations enter into in order to be a member in good standing in the IMF or the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank. But those are the political things in arenas where most of these disputes are settled, and not by individual ambassadors. You have all of the power of the head offices, if you will. You mentioned Occidental. Occidental has a great deal of influence with some congressmen and all. The congressmen work over the State Department, and all the tentacles go out through the international agencies as well. I would also say that you've made too much of a separation into the Cold War and the post-Cold War. In the height of the Cold War, I lived through the nationalization of the International Petroleum Company, the shelling of tuna boats named John F. Kennedy in Peru. Someone said, why the hell don't they name the tuna boat Simon Bolivar, not Kennedy? But there is much more that goes to it than rather through ambassadors alone.
Sure, so yeah, I kind of shouldn't give the impression that it's just ambassadors. It certainly isn't the case. It's sort of a much broader issue. It's both broader kind of within the sort of US policy, or what? There's sort of a broader embassy position, there's a broader sort of US policy position, there's a broader sort of international sort of world we're operating in that has sort of, all these international agreements like you talked about. I will say sort of, I think ambassadors matter. I don't think they're kind of necessarily the only key actor. I think they're one key actor among many. Sort of briefly talking about, that most of these disputes get resolved through these sort of other channels. I don't know about that. I think kind of, if you talk to businesses, so the best way to resolve a dispute is sort of not to get anybody involved, right? Kind of, ideally, you sort of don't need to go sort of outside at all, and you kind of just talk with the host government and sort of figure out yourself. The biggest disputes, we do see that they sort of go to international arbitration and that kind of stuff, but those are actually relatively rare. There have only been sort of a few hundred cases of those. It's sort of much more common that these disputes are resolved sort of behind the scenes some way. And the embassy is often involved in some way. Kind of really figuring out how much kind of causal impact the embassy had is difficult, and sort of I certainly appreciate that. But they are certainly involved, and we can see, at least in some cases, they matter a lot. And so briefly on the kind of Cold War, post-Cold War, I think there is a lot of continuity. And certainly the US government was getting involved during the Cold War, but there is a real shift in the sort of culture at the State Department. And so maybe that's sort of the difference that I'm emphasizing.
I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're getting to 7 o'clock, so let me thank our speaker for the presentation. Thank all of you again for joining us and for your great questions. You'll have only a week to recover and get ready for our next talk. We'll be back here next week. Our colleague Samantha Gross will be here. We'll be sort of keeping to a foreign policy perspective. Samantha's an energy policy expert. She'll be looking at geopolitical energy issues. And I hope you can all join us for that. Thanks again for coming.